Chile's DNA holds secrets that stretch across thousands of years, woven through ancient civilizations, colonial conquests, and migrations from unexpected parts of the world. It's a genetic story unlike any other, one that shapes not just history, but also the lives of millions today. Imagine looking at your DNA and realizing that the roots of your ancestry trace back to one of the oldest human settlements in the Americas, Monte Verde, where people walked this land over 14,500 years ago. But that's just the beginning. Long before the first European ships arrived, Chile was already home to a rich genetic mosaic. The indigenous peoples of this land carried unique lineages that had been shaped by thousands of years of adaptation. The Mapuche, known for their resilience against Spanish conquest, left an indelible mark on the country's DNA. The Aymara thrived in the highlands, developing genetic traits that allow them to breathe and function efficiently in thin air, a trait scientists today are still studying. Further south, in the icy waters of Patagonia, the Kaaskar and Yagan peoples evolved biological traits that help them withstand freezing temperatures, a legacy imprinted into the genes of their descendants. One of the most fascinating revelations of Chilean DNA is how much of it is passed down through the maternal line. Over 88% of Chileans have indigenous mitochondrial DNA, meaning their direct maternal ancestors were Native American women. Yet, on the paternal side, the story is entirely different. The Spanish conquest brought an influx of European men who fathered children with indigenous women, leaving an astonishing 80% of Chilean Y chromosomes with European origins. This striking imbalance reveals a deeper narrative, one of colonization, power dynamics, and how entire populations were reshaped by history. But Chilean DNA doesn't just carry indigenous and Spanish markers. Hidden within it are traces of other migrations that few would expect. African ancestry, though less prominent than in other Latin American countries, still makes up 2 to 5% of Chile's genetic profile, a remnant of the thousands of enslaved Africans brought to Chile during the colonial era. While their numbers were fewer compared to countries like Brazil or the Caribbean, their genetic imprint remains, particularly in the northern regions of Chile. And then there's something even rarer, a Polynesian connection. On Easter Island or Rapa Nui, the genetic heritage of its people is unlike any other in Chile. They carry DNA linked to Polynesia, a reminder of the extraordinary voyages their ancestors undertook across the vast Pacific. Some studies suggest there may have been contact between Rapa Nui and the South American mainland long before European explorers ever arrived. Could this mean Polynesian sailors reached the Chilean coast centuries ago? The genetic evidence continues to be studied, but the very presence of Polynesian DNA within Chilean borders makes it one of the most unique genetic landscapes in the world. Every strand of Chilean DNA tells a story of survival, of conquest, of migration, and of adaptation. It's a genetic fingerprint that is both ancient and evolving, reflecting the layered history of a nation shaped by the old and new worlds alike. And as research advances, who knows what other secrets Chile's DNA might still hold? Long before the first European explorers set foot on Chilean soil, a vast and complex world already existed, one built by civilizations that had thrived for thousands of years. The genetic foundations of modern Chileans were laid by indigenous groups whose ancestry stretches back to the earliest migrations into the Americas. These weren't just isolated tribes, they were cultures with unique adaptations, shaping their DNA in ways still evident today. The Mapuche, fierce warriors of south-central Chile, weren't just legendary for their resistance against Spanish rule. Their genetic legacy remains deeply embedded in modern Chileans. Studies show that even Chileans who do not identify as indigenous often have Mapuche maternal ancestry, proving how dominant their genetic influence was over generations. Their DNA carries traits linked to strong immune responses and resistance to infections, an advantage that might have helped them survive centuries of warfare and European diseases that devastated other indigenous populations. In the northern highlands, the Aymara developed a different kind of resilience. Their genetic adaptation to high altitudes is one of the most fascinating in human biology. Life at over 4,000 meters above sea level means constant exposure to low oxygen levels, yet Aymara populations thrive in these extreme conditions. Their DNA contains variations in genes related to blood oxygen transport and lung efficiency, allowing them to avoid chronic altitude sickness that affects most other populations at similar elevations. Unlike other high-altitude adapted groups, such as Tibetans, the Aymara's adaptation appears to rely more on increased red blood cell production, giving them a distinct physiological advantage in their mountainous homeland. Further south, in the icy waters of Patagonia, another genetic mystery unfolds. The Selknam, Yagan, and Kaaskar peoples lived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. These maritime hunter-gatherers braved freezing temperatures with little clothing, yet their bodies were naturally adapted to conserve heat. Genetic studies suggest that these populations had a higher basal metabolic rate, helping them generate more body heat and withstand extreme cold. Though their numbers dwindled due to European colonization, their genetic legacy still exists among some modern Chileans. What makes Chile's indigenous DNA even more remarkable is how it varies by region. In northern Chile, the indigenous ancestry is often linked to the Aymara and Atacamino, whose genetic makeup reflects ancient connections with the Inca civilization. Meanwhile, central Chile, home to cities like Santiago, shows a genetic shift due to heavier Spanish settlement, leading to a higher proportion of European DNA. In the south, Mapuche ancestry remains dominant, reinforcing the idea that geography played a key role in shaping Chile's genetic diversity. Even today, Chileans carry these ancient markers in their DNA, a testament to the strength and endurance of their indigenous ancestors. Whether it's the high-altitude resilience of the Aymara, the warrior legacy of Mapuche, or the extreme survival adaptations of the Patagonian tribes, the indigenous genetic foundation of Chileans is more than just history. It's a living connection to a past that shaped the present. Chilean DNA is more than just a mix of European and indigenous ancestry. It holds unique genetic adaptations that reveal how humans have evolved to survive in extreme environments. From the high-altitude dwellers of the Andes to the coastal populations exposed to harsh climates, the genetic traits found in Chileans today tell a fascinating story of resilience and survival. One of the most well-documented adaptations is found in the Aymara people, who have lived in the high-altitude regions of northern Chile for generations. At elevations where oxygen levels are dangerously low, most people would struggle to breathe, yet the Aymara thrive. This is due to specific genetic traits that allow for greater oxygen transport in their blood, reducing the risk of altitude sickness. Their bodies produce more red blood cells, increasing oxygen efficiency, while some studies suggest they may also have genetic variations that enhance lung function. Unlike lowland populations, whose bodies react to high altitudes by overproducing red blood cells, which can lead to health problems, the Aymara's adaptation is more balanced, making them naturally suited for life in the mountains. In another part of Chile, a completely different adaptation emerges. The coastal populations of Patagonia, including the Kaaskar and Yagan peoples, develop genetic traits that help them survive in freezing temperatures. Unlike most human populations, which would require thick layers of clothing to survive near freezing waters, these indigenous groups were able to tolerate extreme cold with minimal insulation. Researchers believe this is due to a combination of higher metabolic rates and unique fat distribution, allowing their bodies to generate and retain more heat. While their communities have largely disappeared due to colonization and modernization, genetic traces of these adaptations remain in some Chileans today. Beyond environmental adaptations, Chileans also exhibit genetic traits linked to disease resistance and metabolic health. Some indigenous-derived genetic markers provide natural protection against certain infections, while others may influence how the body processes nutrients. For instance, researchers have identified genes in Chileans that are associated with higher efficiency in fat storage, a trait that would have been beneficial in times of food scarcity, but may now contribute to higher obesity rates in modern urban settings. These adaptations are living proof of how Chile's diverse populations evolved to thrive in some of the most extreme environments on Earth. Whether it's the ability to survive at high altitudes, endure freezing temperatures, or metabolize nutrients differently, the genetic legacy of Chileans is a testament to thousands of years of human adaptation and evolution. Chilean DNA is not just a product of ancient indigenous civilizations and European colonization. It carries traces of migrations and influences that most people wouldn't expect. While Spain played the dominant role in shaping Chile's early genetic landscape, smaller yet significant contributions came from Africa, the Middle East, and even the distant islands of Polynesia. These unexpected influences add another layer of complexity to Chile's genetic heritage. One of the lesser-known genetic threads in Chile comes from African ancestry. While Chile never had the large-scale African slave trade scene in countries like Brazil or the Caribbean, historical records confirm that thousands of enslaved Africans were brought to Chile, often via Peru, during the colonial era. Many of them worked in urban centers, agricultural estates, or domestic labor. Over time, their genetic markers were absorbed into the general population, leaving behind a subtle but measurable African genetic presence. DNA studies estimate that around 2 to 5% of Chilean ancestry comes from Africa, with slightly higher percentages in northern regions, where these populations historically lived. Some Y chromosome analyses have even detected African paternal lineages in certain Chilean families, proving that their legacy is not just cultural but also genetic. Even more unexpected is Chile's connection to the Polynesian people of Easter Island, Rapa Nui. Unlike mainland Chile, where the population is a mix of European and indigenous South American ancestry, the people of Rapa Nui have a completely distinct genetic lineage, tracing back to Polynesian explorers who settled the island over 1,000 years ago. Their DNA carries markers commonly found in populations across the Pacific, from Hawaii to New Zealand. While the Rapa Nui people remain a small community today, genetic studies have revealed something remarkable. There is evidence of ancient contact between Polynesians and South American indigenous groups, possibly before European arrival. Some researchers suggest that Polynesians may have reached the South American coast and interbred with local populations, leaving behind genetic traces that persist in some Chileans today. More recent migrations have also shaped Chile's genetic landscape in subtle ways. In the 19th and 20th centuries, immigrants from the Middle East, particularly from Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, settled in Chile, forming one of the largest Palestinian communities outside the Arab world. While their genetic contribution is relatively small compared to European and indigenous ancestry, it has added new diversity to Chile's gene pool. Similar patterns can be seen with small but influential communities of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, who arrived in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though their numbers were never as large as in other Latin American countries, their genetic presence, though minimal, has been recorded in some modern Chilean DNA studies. These unexpected influences remind us that no genetic history is ever simple. While Chile is often thought of as a blend of European and indigenous ancestry, the reality is far richer. Traces of African, Polynesian, and Middle Eastern migrations have all left their mark, making Chilean DNA a global mosaic shaped by centuries of movement, mixing, and adaptation. Chileans may share a common national identity, but their DNA reveals a fascinating spectrum of regional diversity shaped by geography, historical migrations, and cultural influences. Unlike many other Latin American countries, where genetic differences between regions can be stark, Chile's population is more genetically homogeneous, yet subtle variations still exist, reflecting the unique history of different areas. In the far north, where the Atacama Desert meets the highlands, genetic studies show a strong indigenous presence, particularly linked to Aymara and Atacamino ancestry. This region has some of the highest percentages of Native American DNA in Chile, with certain communities having genetic profiles that are closer to Andean populations in Bolivia and Peru than to Central Chileans. This is due to centuries of cultural and genetic exchange with other Andean civilizations, even before the Spanish arrived. In this region, European ancestry is present but generally lower than in other parts of Chile, making the genetic structure distinct from the rest of the country. Moving to Central Chile, which includes major urban centers like Santiago and Valparaiso, the genetic makeup shifts. This area saw the heaviest Spanish settlement during the colonial period, leading to a higher proportion of European ancestry compared to the north and south. The arrival of Basque and later Italian, German, and British immigrants also reinforced the European component in these regions. However, even in this historically European-influenced area, genetic studies confirm that indigenous ancestry remains a significant part of the gene pool, with most Chileans still carrying Native American maternal lineages. Heading south into Araucania and the surrounding regions, Mapuche ancestry becomes more prominent. Unlike other indigenous groups in Chile, the Mapuche successfully resisted European domination for centuries, maintaining a strong genetic and cultural continuity. This region has some of the highest percentages of indigenous DNA in the country, with a lower European genetic contribution compared to central Chile. Many residents of this area can trace direct ancestry to Mapuche warriors and leaders who played a pivotal role in Chile's history. In the far south, a different pattern emerges. The Magallanes region and Patagonia saw waves of European immigration in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly from Croatia, Germany, and Britain. As a result, the genetic makeup here has a higher percentage of European ancestry than almost anywhere else in Chile. This is especially evident in cities like Punta Arenas, where Croatian surnames are common, and in communities where German heritage has been preserved for generations. Despite this European influence, traces of indigenous Patagonian ancestry can still be found, particularly among families with deep roots in the region. These regional differences highlight how Chile's DNA is not a single, uniform blend but a complex and dynamic genetic landscape shaped by migration, adaptation, and historical events. While Chileans share a mestizo identity, the specific mix of indigenous, European, and other ancestries varies depending on the region, reflecting the diverse paths that different parts of the country have taken over centuries. Genetics doesn't just tell us where we come from, it also plays a role in shaping our health, our risks for certain diseases, and even how our bodies react to different environments. In Chile, the unique blend of indigenous, European, and other ancestries has created a population with distinct genetic traits that influence health in surprising ways. From disease susceptibility to metabolic adaptations, Chilean DNA carries a medical history written into its very structure. One of the most striking genetic influences in Chile is the increased risk of gallbladder cancer, particularly in individuals with high levels of Mapuche ancestry. Research has found a direct correlation between indigenous genetic markers and gallbladder cancer rates, making Chile one of the countries with the highest incidence of this disease in the world. Scientists believe this could be due to genetic variations that affect bile metabolism and inflammation, making some Chileans more susceptible to developing gallstones, which in turn increase cancer risk. Understanding this genetic link is now helping doctors develop better screening and prevention strategies for at-risk populations. Another significant health-related genetic trait in Chileans is metabolic efficiency, an inheritance from their indigenous ancestors. Historically, indigenous populations relied on traditional diets with minimal processed foods and stable food sources. But as Chile shifted toward a more modern diet, rich in carbohydrates and processed sugars, many individuals with high Native American ancestry experienced a greater risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes. This is because certain genetic traits that once helped indigenous ancestors store energy efficiently for times of food scarcity are now working against modern populations in an environment of food abundance. These genetic predispositions mean that Chileans may need different dietary recommendations than populations with primarily European ancestry to maintain metabolic health. High-altitude adaptation is another unique genetic feature found in Chile, particularly among Aymara populations in the north. Their ability to withstand oxygen deprivation at high elevations is linked to specific genetic variants that affect blood oxygen transport and lung function. This has medical implications beyond altitude survival. Understanding these genetic differences could help scientists develop new treatments for conditions related to oxygen deficiency, such as respiratory diseases or heart conditions. In addition to metabolic and respiratory traits, Chilean DNA also influences how the immune system responds to infections. Certain genetic markers of indigenous origin have been linked to stronger immune responses against pathogens, likely an adaptation from centuries of exposure to specific environmental threats. However, these same immune system traits may also contribute to higher rates of autoimmune disorders in some individuals, as an overly aggressive immune response can sometimes lead the body to attack itself. These genetic factors don't determine fate, but they offer a deeper understanding of why certain health conditions are more common in Chile than in other countries. As genetic research in Chile advances, scientists are uncovering new ways to tailor medical treatments, diets, and healthcare approaches to better match the country's unique genetic makeup. The more we understand about Chilean DNA, the closer we get to personalized medicine that takes ancestry into account, improving healthcare for future generations. Chilean DNA is more than just a collection of ancestral influences. It's a living record of history, migration, and adaptation. But beyond the science, genetics also plays a powerful role in shaping identity and self-perception. For many Chileans, DNA testing has become a way to reconnect with lost heritage, uncover unexpected ancestry, and better understand the diverse cultural threads that make up their nation. One of the biggest revelations for many Chileans who take genetic tests is the high percentage of indigenous ancestry, even among those who had assumed their roots were mostly European. Because Spanish colonization was heavily male-dominated, most Chileans today carry Native American maternal lineages, even if their surnames or family traditions reflect European heritage. This realization has led to a growing interest in reclaiming indigenous identity, with some Chileans seeking to learn more about the languages, traditions, and histories of their ancestors. At the same time, DNA testing has also highlighted the deep European influence in Chile, particularly beyond Spain. Many Chileans have been surprised to discover Basque, Italian, German, and even Croatian ancestry in their results, reflecting the waves of immigration that shaped different regions of the country. For some, this has created a stronger connection to European heritage, while for others, it has sparked an interest in exploring family histories that were previously unknown. But perhaps the most unexpected discoveries come from hidden genetic traces that challenge traditional narratives about Chile's past. Some Chileans have found small percentages of African DNA, a reminder of the country's overlooked Afro-Chilean history. Others have been fascinated to learn about the presence of Polynesian markers, particularly in families with ties to Easter Island. These discoveries emphasize that Chile is not a country with just two ancestral influences. It is a nation shaped by a far more complex and diverse genetic history. This renewed interest in ancestry is also influencing how Chileans see their national identity. Unlike some Latin American countries, where racial categories are more rigid, Chile's identity has long been shaped by the idea of mestizage, or mixed heritage. But as genetic research reveals just how diverse this mixing truly is, many Chileans are beginning to question old assumptions about what it means to be Chilean. Does ancestry define identity? Or is identity about culture and lived experience? These are the kinds of questions that DNA testing is now bringing to the forefront. As more people explore their genetic heritage, one thing becomes clear. Chile's DNA is a story of movement, resilience, and transformation. It's a reminder that no nation's history is ever simple, and that the past lives on within us in ways we are only beginning to understand.